jump right in and ask you about your work at the beginning of your career and that really launched your career with Latino voters. And what did you notice about their relationship to the Republican Party? And what about their relationship to the Republican base? Can you tell us a little bit more about how Latino voters fit into the Republican coalition?
Sure. And look, it really starts with a personal story. I grew up in a Mexican-American family. I was the only Republican from the day I turned 18. I came from a family of Democrats, good people, who were just committed to very common, cultural issues. There's a very strong strain of looking out for the least among us, about a commitment to others and a commitment to community. A very strong entrepreneurial strain in the Latino community. And I think just in the course of my growing up, and my family was not very politically active, but we were very politically aware. So followed the news and events of the day. They were always commonly discussed at the dinner table, but always through the lens of how do we make this world a better place and what commitment do we have to each other. And so, when I was a Republican, it was pretty clear I was Republican before I even registered to vote. I think there was a lot of questions, that my father specifically would just kind of ask. And I would say, with everything that you've taught me, I really don't believe that the Democratic Party is the right fit. I think that what we're really talking about is republicanism here.
Yeah.
And this, of course, was in the late 80s. And so I grew up in the Reagan era. And the economic principles and the idea of building better communities through self-reliance and individualism, but not being anti-government to the point where it was destructive, was really central to, I think, my core philosophy, and remains so. I decided to kind of, do some of my academic work at Georgetown. I'm from Southern California. So I went back to Washington, D.C. after doing a couple of congressional races, and realized very quickly that while I had very strong policy ideas, I really loved campaign work. I really loved political work. And I was really fascinated and interested in Latino voters, again, because of my own personal background, but because I recognized that there was this natural affinity with Latino voters and the cultures that I grew up in, the values that I grew up with, and the party. And it was obviously a very troubling time because there was so much demographic change. The Latino community was growing so fast in the Southwest that the Republican Party started to have some trouble with that, I mean, candidly. And so I really feel very lucky and privileged to have seen the Republican Party at the time do very right things and very wrong things. Did a lot of work in Texas when the Texans, George W. Bush's campaign for governor and then ultimately for president, were extremely successful. I had the honor to work with on a number of those campaigns. And they really engaged Latinos directly. There's a real seamlessness with the Hispanic community and Texans. Very natural there for the Republican Party. Not so much in California. And so in the mid-90s, I did a lot of academic work and then actual practical work on understanding trying to understand which way the party would go. If it would go the way of the Texans back in the 90s, I'm convinced we would have a very large majority as a party,
sure,
nationally. Or we could go the way of California, which we've not only gone the way of California and Pete Wilson and Prop 187, but we've stepped on the gas and accelerated under the Trump regime. So, you're seeing the destruction that it's leaving in its wake. But for the past 30 years, I've been working on campaigns for the sizable Latino communities, engaging the community on behalf of Republican candidates. But of course, more recently, it's been a pretty distressing time. And so obviously involved with the Lincoln Project.
Yeah, so I want to get to what made you want to start the Lincoln Project. But before we get there, I want to spend a little bit more time with your work in Republican politics beforehand. So you said there seemed to be a moment of choosing where we could go the way of the Texas GOP or the California GOP. And when is that moment of choosing between sticking to these conservative ideals and values of Reagan and Bush versus something else? Will you walk us through why the California GOP chose what it did? And for those of us not familiar, to share a little bit about that story and how you had a front row seat in seeing it.
Yeah, so look, you have to remember, this goes back a little ways. I don't know how old your average members are. I'm realizing I've got a little gray in my beard and a little less hair than I used to when I started. So I've been through the wars now, and back in the late '80s, and if you watch, you can see a lot of these clips on YouTube. Reagan and Bush, who were kind of the defining political characters of my development, were extremely welcoming to the Latino community, like documented and undocumented. They genuinely believed that, and I think correctly, that an infusion of Latino culture and people would reinvigorate the American dream. I spent a lot of time working on immigration issues because America needs immigration, not just economically, which we clearly do, but we need to continually revitalize our national myth of immigrants, to have people come in at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder and then begin to just climb up into the middle class. It's uniquely American. And without that, when you limit American, that American mythology, you start to literally stagnate as a country. And that's really, I think, what Trumpism is all about. Let me put this a little bit differently. In the 80s and the 90s, we were very proud as a party that our ideas could bring over Democrats. We literally had a name for them. We called them Reagan Democrats. They were blue collar workers that had conservative values. Can you imagine today? Can you imagine today if you called somebody a Reagan Democrat? I mean, the Republican Party despises Democrats. They hate them as though they're the enemy. They're more pro-Russia than willing to work with their Democratic neighbors across the street. And that's a real sign of what has happened and what has changed since the Reagan and Bush era. We've become a very nationalist party. It's become a very white identity party. The Republican Party nationally is 85% white and getting whiter, by the way. Yeah. And that's problematic, not just for a democracy, but obviously for a political party and for a country. And most of this is directly correlates to this extraordinary and unique demographic transformation that we're undergoing as a country. There's never been, ever in the history of our country, a time when a people of European white ancestry as a majority handed the reins of government and leadership and majority to a non-white people. And that scares a lot of people, especially when it's coupled with economic anxiety. There's a lot of nervousness. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of belief that starts to set in that America is not America unless it's a white nation. And that's a lot of what Trumpism is about, unfortunately. And so that's become my fight now is realizing that Latinos, as we grow in population, and there's no question that in the next 20 or 30 years, Latinos will surpass whites as the largest ethnic plurality in America, that is going to redefine our American identity. Doesn't mean we're going to change or lose anything. It means we're going to add a lot to the American fabric the way that we always have. But again, there's a lot of people who simply don't believe that America can possibly be anything other than a white nation.
Yeah, and I think this idea, this tension with who we're becoming through demographic changes doesn't have to be at odds with who America has always aspired to be. And you've spoken about that before. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we reconcile America's changing with the conserving our founding ideals. Particularly, well, if you want to go ahead on that point, then I'll follow up.
Yeah, this is an area that I've given a lot of thoughts to. It's actually where my academic work was at. And so apologize if this sounds a little academic, but I think it is foundational to our country's story. And that is this. When I was younger, while I was in college as an undergraduate, this is in the early mid-90s now, it was clear that within 25 years, a lot of the Southwest would become non-white majority as it is today. And that ultimately, by the end of my lifetime, the country would be a non-white majority, as I just mentioned. What I was really interested in studying and learning was, could a people, my heritage, a people that did not come from a Western European tradition, could we maintain this amazing American experiment based off of constitutional principles and self-reliance, rugged individualism, representative democracy. See, the America could have only been created by a people of, I believe, of white European ancestry. It's part of the Protestant ethic. It's part of puritanical descendancy. It's part of this idea that the basis of society is focused on the individual and individualism first, and from there you build great communities. And there's, I believe that. I believe that to my core. That is in a little bit of conflict with Latin American culture, which believes that there's a more community view first. The way you build strong individuals is by having a strong supportive community. And the truth is you can do both, right? But what I wanted to study and learn was could Latinos, as they emerged, take on the assimilative characteristics of a white majority, at least ideologically, politically. And so I became a Republican because I believe that would be the healthiest way to transition through this demographic bubble that we were going through that was unprecedented. What I never accounted for was the decline of white America, especially those that don't have a lot of economic opportunity or feel rather hopeless because of the changing technology and the loss of manufacturing jobs and the fact that America doesn't really have an economy for people that build with their hands anymore. Mm-hmm. And what that created was a white backlash. And that's exactly what Trumpism is. It's no longer a party. The Republican Party no longer has these platform, a platform at all, right? Of course, but it also doesn't have an underlying ideology that looks anything like the party that I joined in the 1980s and 90s, and that has been with us since the post-World War II era. What it has become is a party defined largely by white identity politics. The most animating issue for the Republican Party are building a wall or opposing Sharia law or blaming the Chinese for the Kung flu, right? These racist dog whistling issues that are clearly meant to speak and motivate white voters that have this white angst. Yeah. And blaming is central to Trumpism. Trumpism is not about individual responsibility. It's about blame. It's about saying, good.
Well, I want to talk to you about this because I think a lot of Republicans, especially politicians, want to pretend like those white grievance politics issues are not what's motivating our base. So I want to return to that. But before we do, I just need to ask you to clarify something that I thought I heard, which was you said America. Did you say that America and the founding ideals could only have been established from white Europeans? Because that doesn't sound right to me. I think that there would be a lot of people to push back against it. So I just wanted to give you a chance to clarify that.
No, that's what I said.
Oh.
Yeah, and I look. It's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing. I think that look, culture matters. That's part of understanding racism. Culture matters, and that also doesn't mean that what we have created here is the end all be all or the zenith or the highest evolutionary space of what humanity can be. I don't believe that either. But the idea that certain inalienable rights, specifically life, liberty, and this is very important, the pursuit of happiness, which was very tied into personal property rights at the time that it was written. Right. That's a very Western European notion. These are not ideology. Liberty and personal property ownership are not central tenets of cultures around the world outside of Western Europe. You just don't see that. It's also why you don't see Western style democracy flourishing in places where Americans have tried to impose it, whether it's been in the Middle East most recently, or whether it's been in African nations where it has really never taken hold in a meaningful way, or the Philippines where we tried to do it during the Teddy Roosevelt administration with the era of Pax Americana. I mean, these notions, and there's no judgment as to whether it's good or bad. It's reflective of the culture. Government reflects the culture from which it emanates.
Yeah. So what do you think? So the tension between pluralism and assimilation, I think for me, pluralism means we accept all cultures and we, allow people to live in the diverse cultures that are in the United States, that everyone is equally American, no matter what culture they're bringing with them. With what you just said, does that require an assimilation to, I think your words were a Protestant ethic? Do people need to assimilate to that, or can someone from a more collectivist society bring that culture into the United States and still be somebody who supports the founding ideals of our country? It sounded to me like you were setting up a distinction there. Is that not true?
That's a fantastic question. And that is fundamentally the question I've spent most of my career trying to address and understand. So let me answer it this way. The history of our country is one of a pluralistic society largely. Up until Teddy Roosevelt's era and the progressive movement in the Republican Party at that time, pluralism was the way of America. The diasporas from Europe. Sorry if this is starting to sound like a college class. I teach these things, but look, it was very common, for example, for German immigrants to come up to the upper Midwest or the Great Lakes areas and keep and hold on to their German language for 2 or 3 generations. Nobody thought that was a bad thing. No one thought that they were less American. Okay, it was very common for different European cultures to come to the United States and establish themselves and stay very homogenous for many, many years, generations. This all changed during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and the progressive reform efforts. Yeah. And there became a very strong social push to become a more melting pot, right? Or assimilative culture, where people were essentially pushed and socially pushed to assimilate into Americanness, where you spoke English and your country and ethnicity took a second position to your American identity. And that again, I don't want to say it's a new phenomenon, but it's a newer phenomenon. It's really only half of our country's story. This is being challenged now as America changes with an influx of non-European immigrants, okay? Everybody was very comfortable with it when they were white immigrants. We were okay with it if you were European. Not entirely. Irish Catholic, for example, were horribly mistreated. Italian immigrants for many generations were discriminated against. But we're seeing a rise of it again. And so when you hear things like people saying, I don't know why you're a hyphenated American. Why can't you just be American? Why do you have to be Mexican American? Why do you have to be Asian American? Why do you have to be African American? Can't you just be American? 99 times out of 100, that's a white person saying that to a minority. Not always, but most of the time, vast majority of the time. And really what it's saying is if you want to be American, you have to leave everything else behind. And that's a relatively new mythology in our national tradition. It's not who we have always been, gotcha. But it's who we've been since the 20s for about 100 years now. And now that's being challenged as we change again. So your question about whether or not we need to be or are we a pluralistic society, or do you need to have assimilative tendencies in order to become more uniquely American? My answer is we have been both at different times in our country's history. And so the fact that we are going to ebb and flow as our dermatology changes, as our complexion changes, should not threaten us from a historical perspective. Now, from an individual perspective, if I live in small town America in the Rust Belt states, which are very monolithically white communities, and I see the local hardware store that's been there for 70 years suddenly turning into a taqueria shop where there's people with different names and different skin complexions, and they don't speak the language very well or at all coming into my town, I start saying, wait a second, this isn't America, right? This is a go back to your country sentiment that you're hearing all too often. And it's creating this sense that this is not what America is. It's foundationally and historically not true. We have been, for the first 100 years of our existence, a pluralistic society that worked extremely well. We have also been an assimilative American culture that has also arguably worked extremely well. But there's no evidence to suggest that one way is uniquely American or the other. It has simply reflected the times when we have had dramatic increases of immigration or social change.
Yeah. I think we underestimate the tectonic impacts of this change to our detriment. I'm in seminary. I'm studying to become a pastor, but I'm also doing a graduate program where my thesis is on racial reconciliation. So this is the types of
Love
stuff
that.
that I'm focused on too.
Yeah.
I'm specifically trying to figure out a classical liberal framework for reconciliation in a pluralistic society.
I
So
love that. We need to have dinner and talk about this, because this is the
yeah.
stuff I love this. I would love to hear more about that. Probably not the best time now, but after the election, I'm gonna take you to a long dinner. We're gonna have a good talk.
Sounds good.
Everybody's welcome, by the way. We'll Facebook Live it or something.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to ask you one more question about this, and then we're going to go to the Lincoln Project, which I know a lot of people want to talk about.
Okay.
So the question is, we have these changes in our country brought on by demographic changes, and there is going to be this tension between what you claimed as, white working class in the Rust Belt and Latino influences in our politics and demographic changes. So that's obviously going to create some societal transition, and that's going to manifest in our politics. Do you think how can politicians use this moment of change to speak to our better angels instead of demonizing? Do you think this change do you think we need politicians who can help us navigate these changes? And what do those policies look like? How are you advising candidates that are having to try to lead in a time of rapid change?
Another fantastic question. And what you're really asking is, how do I take kind of the academic work that I've done and put it into a practical effect? Like, what does all that mean? All these ideas and words you're talking about. What does it mean in the context of a campaign? The first thing I'll say is this: politicians are probably uniquely ill-suited to lead us through these times, because a politician naturally seeks its own base of support. And the best way to create a base, unfortunately, is to provide contrast. This is who I am, that's who the other person is. And at a time when there's dramatic social transformation like we're experiencing now, race becomes a very easy, convenient way to do that. It's exactly what Donald Trump is trying to do. When you don't have policy ideas, when you don't have an ideology that is bigger or bigger than a minority, when you can't get a working majority any other way, the best way to do it, unfortunately, is to use a lightning rod of these issues to catalyze a majority ethnicity or racial group to comprise a numerical electoral majority. There's an old saying in politics amongst practitioners, which is, in politics, you win by addition, not subtraction. Mm-hmm. Well, Donald Trump proved that completely untrue. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump literally wins by subtracting, and that's possible in the Electoral College. Donald Trump in November will lose by the largest popular vote margin in history, coming on the heels of his previous record of losing the largest popular vote margin in history, but wins because what he's able to do is organize and mobilize the right number of states, which incidentally, with very few exceptions, are amongst the most homogenous and monolithic white states in the country. His coalition is really from the deep South, which is usually 2/3 white or so, at least 50%. And that goes all up through the Midwest and up into the suburban states of the Great Lakes area and into the mountain Midwest. If you're able to do that and catalyze that, you can put together an electoral victory. So that's the way that he's been able to accomplish that. So again, politicians, I think, are uniquely ill-suited to help guide us through the transformations, the racial and demographic transformations that we're going through. They have to get through this. And again, this is unique in American history. This 20-year stretch we're about to embark on has never been done successfully in a democracy before. And it's not just the United States that's dealing with it. It's actually It's actually a phenomenon we're seeing in Western Europe, and in large part, it explains the rise of ethnic populism that we're seeing in Germany, that we're seeing in, well, really throughout the world, but particularly in the Western world.
Yeah.
So the difference, and we won't get too far off topic here, but the best way to guide people through this is usually through community-based and faith-based organizations that are coalitions beyond that, multi-faith or coalitions, multiracial coalitions, and then push the politicians to reflect that, because the politicians will go wherever they see a majority. That's kind of their job. And so unfortunately, they're not really well positioned to help democracies through this type of social transformation.
Yeah. What I think is really hard about that is, I agree with you. It's very easy for a politician, especially like Donald Trump, who commands such a large microphone, to weaponize race and to drive us further into the ground. But the only way to build us back up, I agree with you, is through community-based coalitional approaches. And that is hard work. That takes years of building trust and relationships. And so it's easy to tear it down. It's way harder to tear it back up. I think in our national, I know people are here to listen to you, but this is my soapbox for just 1 second, is that
Sure.
in our national environment where we give so much attention to the president and the presidency, there's really no alternative place that commands the same microphone. So that's something we need to work through as a society. But you've chosen politics, and particularly electoral politics, to make these changes. So can you tell us a little bit about your impetus for starting the Lincoln Project and why you felt like this is the right time and the right work to be doing?
Sure. And, just so everybody's aware of the origin story, there are 8 of us that started this. I was not in the first 1 or 2 meetings. I was asked to join later, which is fine with me. But the idea really was that as we were heading into impeachment, it became very clear that even when there was this clear threats to the Constitution, that the elected Republican leadership in the Senate and in the House had completely failed not only the Republican Party, but the country. There was already rumblings that they were not going to hear evidence in the trial, that a lot of the members had already decided that this was going to be a quote-unquote partisan impeachment.
Yeah.
And ironically, it fell to the Republican political consulting class to become the moral arbiters of the party, which is really ironic. And I say this as a political consultant, very unfortunate, right? You would expect that there would be some sort of virtue somewhere in the party, and save for Mitt Romney, there was not. And as we became aware that the party was really going to enable whatever the president desired, including violating the law and trampling the Constitution, that this was a threat not only to the party, which we were aware of for years, but it was becoming a threat to the country.
Yeah.
It was really the very first signs where authoritarianism was manifesting.
Right.
And at that point, when I got the call, and I was asked, my response was immediate. It's come at great cost, but I don't regret it for a moment. I'd do it again in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Even if it had not become as big as it was, if it was still just 8 of us and no one was listening to us, and we were going to take the fight on, I can guarantee you, knowing these people, we would still be doing it, even if it was just 8 of us. That's just the way we're constituted.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to go back to the origin story of Lincoln Project's Cooper Union Hall speeches. That's when you all kicked off the operation, and it seemed like a lot of the speeches that night, they drew on these 2 themes that Trump was affecting in the party. One was the authoritarian impulses, and that revolved around impeachment and whether or not Republican senators voted to impeach, and then the nationalism impulses. And in your speech, you drew a parallel between Lincoln's Cooper Union speech that launched his bid for the presidency and Trump's Trump Tower speech that launched his bid. And can you talk about the two different visions and views that those speeches represented, and why you think it's important to draw distinctions between the founding of the Republican Party and what it is today?
Yeah, Reed, that's a really great question too. You ask a lot of really great questions. The Cooper Union speech, I think, was a very important speech, a very important night, not just for the Lincoln Project, but really because I think in many ways it established an exclamation point at that characterizes the end of the modern Republican Party as we've known it. And I think that there is a certain honor in being asked to articulate that literally on the 160th anniversary of the night that Abraham Lincoln gave the speech at Cooper Union on the same stage, literally from the same podium. That moment did not escape me. And, look at the Lincoln Project, we're political consultants. So a lot of us are just kind of direct and wanted to talk about the moment as it stood. But I actually reached out to a number of Lincoln historians just to make sure that my reading and understanding of the Cooper Union speech was as historically accurate as it could be. And then, as the only person of color in the Lincoln Project, there was a certain responsibility to remind all of us, the party, the public, and to have this established in the history of Cooper Union, because the speech that night will be part of its history, that the Republican Party was literally, here's the irony. The Republican Party was the first political party in this country that was established for racial justice. Our founding, our principle was to make clear that the lives of Black people mattered. It was the first Black Lives Matter movement, literally. That is the core essence of what the Republican Party was created for as an abolitionist movement. Now, of course, it's changed and it's iterated a million different ways, and it no longer embodies that. But understanding Lincolnism and the abolitionist movement and what the Republican Party rose up at that moment in time from that stage 160 years ago is central to understanding how we got to the end point where we are now. So that speech at Cooper's Union launched not just a man in his career in the presidency, but it launched a social justice movement. Now, it took us a war to get through it, but that's what it was about. It was about catalyzing the notion of equality and justice for people who were not white. Now, fast forward 160 years, and you have a president who, a few blocks away at Trump Tower, comes down the escalator, and literally his first assault on non-white people is with Mexicans. That didn't escape me at all. He's offended virtually everybody, but he began with an attack on something that was very personal to me. It was about my family. It's about my lineage. It's about my story. And I believe that you cannot have both of those ideologies under the same tent. They can't be in the same party. They're inconsistent with each other. Mm-hmm. We are either a party that stands for racial and social and justice and equality, or we're not. I mean, it's really that simple to me. And it also doesn't escape me that the only person that was heckled that night was me when I was talking about race. That doesn't surprise me. That's something that's been consistent in my career too, especially with Republican audiences.
Right.
But that contrast, it really defines the beginning and the end. You can't understand why Trump killed republicanism as it's been known throughout its history unless you understand the origin story of the Republican Party and how it was catalyzed that night at Cooper Union.
Yeah. I was just about to bring up the fact that you were heckled during your speech, and I have a couple of the lines that you were heckled for.
Great.
You said you said the modern GOP cowers in the face of change. It's devolved into fear and anger over hope and aspiration. It's regressed into identity politics. That got a boo. It's become the home of an aggrieved racial minority. The party is 80% white, and the California Party is a state that's 80% white and a state that's only 36% white. I agree with you on all these things, and also, the need to heal the country's racial divides and the way that the Republican Party has expanded those racial divides is something that I think that I want to dedicate my life to addressing. But I think a lot of people would ask if haven't we seen this coming? And if we're looking for a movement that stands up for racial justice, isn't that the Democratic Party? Can you just share why you've remained a Republican for so long, and whether or not you think the Republican Party has to stay the party of white grievance?
Yeah, I can speak to that, give you my impressions on that too. Let me talk about the Republican Party first, and then we'll talk about the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, again, has demonstrated, and it's probably a longer discussion for another time, that it is, in the words that you just said, as you were reading them, I was like, yeah, that sure sounds like me. It has become the party of white identity politics. It's no longer the party of smaller, more transparent government. It's no longer a party that emphasizes freedom through free trade and through free markets. It's no longer a party that believes in a strong international framework to expand the American experiment abroad. Those ideas they're not anywhere. They're not apparent anywhere in the Trump administration or in the Trump era. What is very apparent is that as white America becomes smaller, it's becoming more intense and monolithic, and it's behaving, in the words that you just said in my speech, like an aggrieved racial minority. That's not uncommon in America. That's a very common history, but that has historically been Black Americans and Latino Americans, and increasingly Asian Pacific Islander Americans. Never for white America, but that is evolving. As the party becomes smaller and more monolithic, it will grow more intense, and it will focus more on its commonalities, not on ideology, but on racial homogeneity, right? It becomes more monolithic. This is not unlike what we see in France with the National Front, or with other nationalist groups, white nationalist groups. You saw the president speaking directly to that in the debate the other night. He's calling for a race war. He's calling for people of similar race, the Proud Boys, right? These are white nationalists, to rise up and take arms in potentially an insurrection. That's literally what we're experiencing right now at this moment in time. And so that again stands in contrast to our principle and to our founding, as I mentioned before, as a party. But so then the next question becomes, well, if you're not a Republican, are you then a Democrat? My answer to that is no, I'm not a Democrat. And the reason why is the same reason that at 18 I chose not to be a Democrat, although I grew up in a Democratic household. The idea is you cannot, foundationally for me, you cannot achieve racial equality without income equality. And let me start there, but let me also mention this, don't let me get too far away from this. If we believe that racism is truly systemic, and I do, a lot of Republicans don't, but I believe that racism is a systemic problem in America because of our origin story as Americans, then doesn't it stand to reason that the entire system, what's the definition of systemic, has a race problem? It's not the province of the Republican Party or conservatives. There are deep-seated racial problems in the Democratic Party and with progressives as well. And let me walk through some of those. I'll walk through some of those because this was my original issue that I had when determining which party best represented my views. It's not a coincidence, I don't believe for a moment, that those states that have the biggest racial income inequality problems are the bluest of blue states. That those states that have the largest housing problems, the largest incarceration problems for people with color, the lowest educational attainment rates, the worst disparities on health for people of color versus whites, the highest obesity rates, and the highest childhood starvation rates are all in states that have policies that have failed Black and brown communities.
Yeah.
Now, there's a good argument that most of these states are more diverse, and that's absolutely true. There's not a whole lot of Latinos in Iowa, for example, as a good standard. That's a fair and equitable argument. However, to have long-term sustained generational poverty now makes you ask the question, is this something inherent in Black and brown people that doesn't allow them to succeed, which frankly is the definition of racism?
Yep.
Or is there something systemic in the way our government is working or not working to prevent economic aspiration and an upward trajectory for people? For me, the answer is pretty simple. 25 years ago, when I was younger and just registered to vote, and I was having these discussions with my family, to me, it was very predictable that California would be where it would be. Right. And here we are. It's a one-party state where by every social and economic metric, California is probably the single worst state for Latinos to be living. The quality of life is terrible and getting worse.
Can I jump in? Because I agree with you that systemic racism is real and that government policies can perpetuate that. So Green New Deal policies were inherently racist. Who got loans from the government that went to white people primarily? That those differences were exacerbated by redlining policies that were implemented by governments. That was true in red states and blue states, and red cities and blue cities. All those things are true. I think now the Republican Party doesn't seem to care about it. They don't even want to admit that systemic injustice is real. The Democratic Party, at least some elements, are more willing to. I don't think we would see an Amy Klobuchar campaign on that, but I don't think she would deny its existence. And so, like you, I'm center-right. I'm not a Democrat. But I don't think that our coalition on the right has a lot of political power right now. So my question for you as a political strategist is, how do we go about building that political power around these ideas of both limited government and fighting systemic racism?
That's a really good question. Look, let me back up and say I believe that what is happening right now is, and you mentioned Republican coalition. I don't think there's much of a Republican coalition left anymore. I think it's becoming so homogeneous and so monolithic. It's really very overwhelmingly, like I said, it's an 85% white party. It's increasingly losing college-educated voters. It's losing women at an incredibly fast rate. It's really kind of the party of non-college educated white males. That's not much of a coalition, especially in America. That's the fastest shrinking demographic. The Democratic Party is kind of the party of everybody else, which makes it an extraordinarily large coalition. And the challenge that the Democratic Party is going to have, and I think we're going to see this on full display when Joe Biden wins, and I'm confident that he will, if the Democrats have control of both houses and the presidency, you're going to see a very large split between a wealthier white progressive base that runs the Democratic Party, that is really truly the leadership of the Democratic Party. And there's going to be a splinter between that group and increasingly it's black and brown populist base, not unlike what you saw with kind of the Trump folks overtaking the establishment of the Republican Party, eschewing kind of the intellectual and donor class. They're you saw this with the rise of Bernie Sanders, right? Yeah. Bernie Sanders was running against the Democratic Party as much as he was running against the system being rigged, meaning the capitalist system. Right. He was saying that systemically was the same problem. Now, we don't talk a whole lot about Bernie Sanders, but he really is a fascinating figure in American political history because not too long ago, he came within 7 points of unseating probably the best prepared, most establishment candidate in the history of American politics, becoming the Democratic nominee under Hillary Clinton. 7 points. I mean, he almost upended the entire system. And then 4 years later, he, if you had set aside Trump and Trumpism and the overwhelming desire of the average Democratic voter to get rid of Donald Trump, he probably would have won the nomination too in a multi-candidate field. Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar haven't gotten out and done what the Republican primary candidates did in 2016, he probably would have gone into the convention. Well, not that there was a convention, but had there been a convention pre-pandemic, with a plurality of the votes. And I think that would have been a civil war in the Democratic Party of the establishment folks trying to take the nomination away from him, even though he walked in with a plurality. I think that's exactly what would have happened.
Yeah.
So that's very in the weeds, but my point really is this. The Bernie Sanders wing of the party, the populist wing of the party, is far more ascendant than anybody realizes, including the Democrats. And that was the warning signs of Bernie Sanders. In many ways, it was very similar to the Tea Party movement that began during the Obama years in the Republican Party. It's as much against the Democratic Party as it is against the system that they're railing against. It's why it was so successful with Latino voters, by the way.
Yeah.
And as Latino voters grow and as Latino voters expand, and as the income inequality divide expands, and especially when you see it in blue states, right? These states overwhelmingly that are dominant by the Democratic Party, having very, very wealthy people and very, very poor people and a shrinking middle class, you have to say how much of the problems in a state like California are the responsibility of Republicans. You got to really dig deep to make that claim. And
Right.
at a certain point, that coalition doesn't work anymore. And I think that ultimately is what is most likely to happen, because the Republican Party is not going to split in two. There's no moderate and conservative wing of the Republican Party. It's a nationalist party, like monolithically now.
Mm-hmm.
And that will continue to shrink. It's not expanding, it will shrink. So the Republican Party will get smaller, while the civil war within the Democratic Party will exacerbate. And ultimately, if it can't reconcile those issues, it'll split in two.
Okay. So, Mike, I know you're incredibly busy. You are leading probably the most popular political movement in America right now with the Lincoln Project. So we appreciate the time that you've given us. Do you have time for a couple more questions before we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Apologize to everybody for being so academic too.
No, this
is a college classroom than a political consultant. But I'll do what
this is great. No, this is great. So, so you've talked about the increasing populism on the left. The right is already nationalist populist.
Right.
So I guess the question I have for you is, what comes next? Is the Democratic, we have a two-party system right now. So if the Democrats' civil war results in the AOC Bernie wing being ascendant and taking over the levers of power, do you think we're locked in a party, a governing system with two populist parties? Or do you think if there is this populism, hyper-partisanship, which is why we have the two-party system that we have, do you think that will melt away? That seems a little too good to be true. So if the populists win on the left, where does everybody in the center go?
That's a great question. Let me answer it this way. I don't believe there's a center in American politics. I think that's a myth. I believe what is happening is there has been a split between both parties on the right and the left, and we can characterize it a number of ways. Either the haves and the have-nots, or the insiders and the outsiders, or those that have influence and those that do not. It's manifested most clearly and delineated most clearly by college education, which is why I have pushed strategically for the Lincoln Project to focus so strenuously on college-educated Republicans, which is the group that we have peeling off the fastest from the Trump party. But the problem with the Republican Party is there's not the college-educated insider base is not what it used to be. When I was younger, when you said rich old white people, you were talking about Republicans. That's no longer the case anymore. You're overwhelmingly talking about progressives, not just Democrats, but progressives. And that change has dramatically altered the trajectory for the Republican Party and its sustainability as a real legitimate organization. So I guess what I'm saying is, I believe that we are no longer, or at least in the near future, we're no longer going to look at the political parties as right and left and the way that you and I have known it for most of our adult lives. We're going to be talking about it in terms of top and bottom, right? Or inside and outside, or those that have influence and those that do not. And so politicians like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are going to become more commonplace, while candidates like George W. Bush and Joe Biden will become less commonplace. Because the ideological spectrum that we're, look, the debate between the Republican and Democratic Party has, at its core elementary essence, has been about whether or not government should be bigger or smaller. Fair enough? Republicans think it should be smaller. Democrats think it should be bigger.
Right.
We're not really having that debate, right? Donald Trump has never given a speech about the virtues of smaller government because he doesn't care, and neither do the Republicans. It's far smaller than we think it is. And I would argue that that is increasingly the same on the left. Okay? Mm-hmm. So what that means is we're no longer going to be talking about politics what we have for the last 150 years about the size and role of government. We're going to be attacking institutions. We're going to attack all things. Well, let me give another example. Sorry if I'm rambling a little bit, but it's kind of what I do. If you use the word big in anywhere on the political spectrum, it's automatically evil. On the right, you say big government, people hate it. They don't know why. They'll support Obamacare. They'll support a big military. They'll support their government expenditures, but they don't trust government. On the left, if you say big pharma, big oil, big plastic, big banks, big whatever, right? It's basically a speech from Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. The left reacts the same way. They don't trust private industry the way that the right does. But it all is foundationally a part of the same social phenomenon, which is people have lost faith in institutions, whether they're private or public sector. That is going to be the defining characteristic of our politics over the next 20 or 30 years. And it's directly correlates to the income inequality gap and the technological economy that we've built that is leaving so many people behind so fast. People simply feel out of control.
So I don't think I hear a lot of politicians that are explicitly talking in those terms. They might be doing it because they're conditioned to. So do you think just nobody gets that yet? Are there any groups that are tackling these challenges in a way that gives you hope or confidence?
No, but what I'm saying is very academic. It's kind of this. You can't put that in a Lincoln Project commercial and make that work, right? But what it devolves into is you have Donald Trump saying he's running against the swamp, and then Bernie Sanders says the system is rigged. They're saying the same thing. It's the same message, right? It just depends on how you process the information and who you think the boogeyman is at the top. You either think it's the government that's trying to get you, or you think it's private sector that's trying to poison you through your food or through your water. But ultimately, these populist ideas find some commonality. And so, for example, you have Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump finding commonality on trade issues, right? They become very isolationist and protectionist because one thing that they can agree on as a threat is a foreign threat, and that foreign markets are a threat to our workers. So they agree on that. And increasingly, you're going to find these politicians finding more and more common agreements as they become more isolationist. And isolationism is a hallmark of nationalism, as is protectionism. The danger is there's a whole lot of other ugly isms that come very shortly thereafter that are race-based.
Right. So
and that's the fear. That's what we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing it happen right now.
So this will be the last question. So is this the natural end of our politics? Is this the natural end is nationalism and extremism? Or are you seeing signs of hope? And maybe if you're not seeing them, will you give us some productive work that we can begin to do, no matter how small the initial group is, how feeble those efforts might seem at first, so that we can build a more positive politics?
Well, having said all this, I'm actually quite optimistic about the American experiment and where things are going. And I want to share with you a little bit as to why. I believe that a very big part of America feels that it is in decline. And and Trumpism is essentially about the end of Americanness for a wide swath of people. And so that's why there's this rage. It's why it's a politics of anger and blame. And ultimately, it's about the politics of hopelessness. They don't see a future better for themselves or their children. And so they're more than willing to tear down the institutions that have served this country well for 240, 250 years. But something else is happening, and this is where I find hope. It's with these new American majorities that are emerging, especially with people of color, right? These are people who are the working class. These are people who make a living with their hands in the technological era. They literally are building America still at this point in time. And every generation, not every, but most generations of Americans have had to fight for this democracy, right? We envision that. We always think about the mythology of the Revolutionary War, right? Or the North versus the South, or storming the beaches at Normandy to protect freedom and our way of life. Those are all very true. They're very distant memories. But what is happening at this moment is the threat to us is not as much foreign as it is domestic, but the fight remains the same, right? And this struggle of an emerging, demographically different America trying to hold on to these institutions that, again, were created by white European or white European ancestors, very foundationally different, as I was mentioning, than the cultures from which they came. Is, to me, there's nothing more American than that. There's nothing more American than that, because it's been easy to believe in these inalienable rights, right, that our Creator bestowed upon us, as long as everybody looked the same. But if they're truly inalienable, if they're truly the blessings of all of mankind, then it really only works if it works for everybody. And we all know it hasn't worked for everybody. Right. It hasn't worked for everybody. Now is that opportunity. And so if the American experiment, if the idea of America is actually going to work, this is that moment. And that there's something beautiful about that. There's something humbling about being the first generation of Americans to lead us into that. And so I think the work that you're doing, I think the work that we're involved with in this campaign matters. I think it's a very pivotal moment beyond just the destructiveness of what is happening with this administration. It's either going to be the beginning of something new and incredible, or it's going to be the end of something that was incredible.
Wow. Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us and for that conversation. I think it's rare in an election year to have such a nuanced conversation, but I think it's really important that while we're doing the daily work that needs to be done, which you certainly are, we take steps back to reflect on how our actions are contributing to the larger conversation and the larger elements at work. So thank you. And Lauren from North Carolina joined the chat, and she wanted me to share this with you. She said, please share that Mike's insights, efforts, time, authenticity, and sincerity have given me hope from this election. So Mike, I think a lot of people share Lauren's sentiments.
That's very kind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Rita. It's been an honor, and I'm really a big fan of your work, and thanks for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, of course. And I'll take you up on that lunch so we can talk more later. So thank